Christmas, or really any winter holiday for that matter, is supposed to be a happy time for children. You wait all year long. The weather slowly shifts away from the summer into the dazzling colors of autumn. Then, the serene yet unforgiving winter. You begin to count the days right up until the holiday, with thoughts of gifts rushing through your mind. For the majority of my adolescence, Christmas held a very special place in my heart. Well, it still does, but now for a much different reason. Year after year, I'd run around in the snow and watch my father put up all sorts of lights around the house. It usually took him a few days to complete, but once it was finished, the sight was astonishing. I'd often help my mother decorate the house. We'd put up numerous wreaths and ribbons along each door and window. Despite it being so cold outside, the decorations seemed to bring in a warmth all on their own. The tree was the final piece to the puzzle, the culmination of all the decorations. I'd carefully hang glass ornaments from the slightly wavering branches and watch as the lights of the room would reflect off of them. The tree would then be strung up with lights, and my mother would quickly shut off all the lights in the house before illuminating the tree. There was just something about seeing a brightly colored Christmas tree that put a smile on my face. The day would inevitably arrive, and I would wake up as early as possible so I could rush down to my presents. Of course, there would be presents underneath the tree leading up to the day itself, but seeing the new packages seemingly brought by Santa made me even more excited. My parents would sluggishly pull themselves out of bed and watch as I tore through multicolored wrapping paper, rip open boxes, and throw out handfuls of packing peanuts. For the first decade of my life, this is how I spent every Christmas. Then, on my 13th birthday, that all changed. The year hadn't gotten off to a great start. My father had injured his back at work in early February, and he had been out of commission for nearly 4 months. Although he was receiving compensation for his injury, it wasn't a whole lot to sustain our family. That, coupled with the mounting medical cost, was stretching our budget rather thin. My mother had to pick up a second job just to cover our basic needs. Thankfully, my father ended up being alright and he had recovered nicely. He resumed working about halfway through summer. As August rolled around, my mother was able to drop her second job but still needed to work a lot of hours to make up the difference. As November was fast approaching, I had become accustomed to spending nights alone. At the beginning of their new work shifts, they had tried to hire a babysitter for me but were unable to find a good one. After realizing I was more than capable of not burning the house down, they left me to my own devices. That being said, I wasn't left home alone for entire days at a time. Both my parents worked the night shift, so I pretty much just spent the nights alone. December had arrived, and with how overworked my parents were, they were left with little energy to decorate our home. It seemed as if our house was the only one on the block that had no lights on outside. I did wake up one morning a few days into December to see our Christmas tree standing tall in our living room. While I understood why my parents couldn't decorate this year, seeing the tree was a surprising yet welcome sight. As the days continued, my parents began to pick up more and more hours at work. They began going into work earlier and coming home later. By the end of the first week, I was spending most of my days home alone. At first, I thought it was awesome to be by myself. I was king of the proverbial castle. Then, after a week of it, the exhilaration steadily wore off, and the daunting isolation became apparent. Although I was quite familiar with my home, lying in bed at night with no other soul present was unnerving. The atmosphere would shift as the sun fell from the sky. The previously bright and snowy day would turn into a desolate, frigid darkness. The nights wouldn't have been that bad if it wasn't for the noises that seemed to appear out of nowhere. They started roughly at the beginning of December. They were subtle at first, quietly echoing down my darkened hallways while I tried to sleep. It's difficult to describe exactly what they sounded like. It was almost like a blind man with asthma was wandering around my house. A mix of deep wheezing hisses and rhythmic thuds against the walls outside my bedroom door. After hearing these noises the first time, I asked my parents if they had ever heard it. My parents both glanced at one another before shaking their heads. My father told me it was probably the house settling. Older homes are prone to all sorts of noises. Furnaces kicking on, foundations shifting slightly. Any number of things could cause it. He assured me, though, that it was nothing to worry about. Despite his explanation, it did little to deter my uneasiness. The sound made me very nervous, but I didn't want to add to my parents' stress by worrying them, so I kept my concerns to myself. Nearly a week after asking my parents about the noises, something happened. As I sat in my bedroom playing a video game, I glanced out of my window to see my father getting into his car for work. The exhaust from his car clouded up the driveway, and after a minute, he was gone. Roughly an hour or so later, my mother opened my door to tell me she was heading off to work as well, and for me to behave myself. I returned a nod to her as she put on her jacket. A few minutes later, the garage opened, and my mother backed her car out and then drove away. Another night alone, I thought as I glanced out of the window a moment longer before returning to my game. Slowly the sky changed from a bright blue to a pastel pink. The sun was dipping below the horizon. It wasn't much longer until the sky was black with a few stars peeking through the clouds above. It wasn't much later until I started to hear those subtle noises again. The thumps and taps off the walls. The gasping, ragged breaths. My brain tried to cling onto my father's explanation, but I had never heard a house make these sounds before. I quickly shut off my game. I thought that if I was quiet enough, the sounds wouldn't be able to find me. I got into my bed, which sat in the corner of my room away from the door. I pulled the blanket up onto my shoulders and waited, listening. The sounds grew and grew in volume, drawing closer and closer to my door. Like all the previous nights, they seemed to stop just outside. I shut my eyes in a childish attempt to wish away my fear. When I finally opened them, my eyes darted to my bedroom door. I could feel the color drain from my face as I saw that my bedroom door had been cracked open. In the dark space between my door and the frame was a face. Two glassy eyes stared at me. They had a crazed, wild look about them. The skin was pale but appeared to be covered in some sort of grime. After nearly a minute of staring, the mouth below the eyes split open, revealing a rotten, grotesque smile. I felt my body become stiff with fear. I wanted to shut my eyes tightly again and pray that it was just a bad dream, that I wasn't actually seeing anyone outside my door, but I didn't dare close my eyes. I struggled to keep from blinking as this thing stared back at me. Then, the door began to creak open a bit further. It started to push its head further into my room. Long, matted hair clung to its scalp. The hair dangled in front of its face. Patchy hair peppered its lower jaw as its head was now fully in my bedroom. I screamed. I screamed so hard I thought the windows would shatter under the resonance. The head instantly withdrew, and my bedroom door shut. I ran over to my window, threw it open, and climbed outside. Thankfully, I was on the first floor, so the drop wasn't dangerous. I dashed through the snow to my neighbor's house and pounded firmly on the door until someone answered. Mrs. Morgan answered the door. She had lived next to us for quite a few years and was friends with my mother. She saw my panicked expression and asked me what was wrong. I told her I saw someone inside my house. She did her best to calm me down and called my parents. An hour or so later, my mother arrived to get me. She was upset that I had caused all this trouble, but that was until we began to walk back to our house. As we approached, My mom scolded me for leaving the front door open. I froze in my tracks and refused to move. I told her that I had jumped out of my bedroom window, that I never touched the front door. It was at that moment that I think my mom started to believe me. She promptly called the police, and after a short while, 2 cars showed up. The police searched our house and found something unsettling. Someone had been living in our attic. There was a space in our attic behind a few boxes that had been made into a small living area. Newspapers lined a makeshift bed, and various rotten food items had been left about. The officers questioned me, and I described the man as best I could. About a half hour later, the police knocked on our door. My mother called me over, and the police said they had someone in custody. They wanted me to see if I could identify the man. They stood him in the street with a bright light in his eyes. Those same crazed eyes and matted hair. Although I knew he couldn't see me, he still turned and flashed a rotten, toothy grin in our direction. I told the officer that, yes, he was the one I saw in my bedroom. They thanked me and my mother, made some calls on their radios, and left. Ever since that day, and every winter since, I have made sure to triple check all of the locks on my doors and windows in my house. While I am an adult now, I still can't help but feel a chill run down my spine whenever December rolls around. And it's not just because of the cold weather outside.